Hi, it's lovely to be here. Nice to see all these bright faces. So, my name's Clive Hyland. You may notice the link with Chris. I happen to be his dad. You know, one of my more dubious achievements in my lifetime. There you go, you've got to live with it. So,
talk us through how you made it.
That was a link back to sexual happiness, right? But you know, I don't want to go there at the moment, so that's good. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is bring a bit of science to the table. So my story very quickly is 30 years as a business career, ended up as a CEO of an organization of about 1,500 people. So with that experience of what it's like to be at the top of an organization, I then changed course and went back to my studying of people. And whereas originally it was psychology, more latterly it was all around neuroscience. So I want to share some of that with you. Now, I'll do that in a certain way, but first of all I want to comment on how wonderful it is on all the bright ideas that are coming up in here, you know, in this setup today, which give me hope. Because when I look outside, there's a lot of bad stuff that's going on, whether we're talking organizations or society or environment. And part of the proposition I'm going to offer to you in this next 25 minutes, and I'll use every second, is very much about, we've got to think again about who we are. And a lot of people have touched on that, but rather than just be my opinion, I want to give you some insight into the science. Now, of course, I don't have much time to do that, because I'm talking neuroscience, which is a huge subject in its own right. But I'm also going to touch on things like physics. So let me put it into context. So, my proposition is we have to think again. Everyone hear me okay? Just check in with that, right? Yeah. There are fundamental flaws in the way that we look at ourselves. And part of our experience now is to open up those flaws and look again. It's interesting that Gareth, you'd think this would actually be planned, touched on some of this stuff. Of course, I should have maintained it was planned, but there. So fundamentally, what I'm talking about here is that our view of ourselves, exactly as Gareth said, you know, in the early days was very much defined by philosophy and religion. And then back in the last century, there was a huge emergence of psychology. And as somebody who studied that, I could see the value of it. You know, it took us a huge step forwards in terms of understanding of humanity. But now we're in a different space, because neuroscience is offering us a direct ability to look into the brain and see what's happening. As psychologists, we were stumped. We didn't have that ability. We didn't have the imaging technology that now is available to us. So we've built up a huge theoretical base called psychology, some of which is amazing, but some of which is deeply flawed. And we have to work the difference out between the two. So, now, it's about these converging worlds of science, but it's also not just about science. You know, I spend time researching areas that I would broadly call non-science. And by that I could mean prayer, clairvoyance, telepathy, all the stuff that typically hasn't stood up to the normal rules of science and was therefore dismissed by it. And the reason it's been dismissed by it is science typically has cause and effect rules. So if something should happen, it should happen every time for it to be scientifically valid. But now, particularly in areas like quantum physics, we're recognizing that the universe itself is not a predictable place. It's a self-organizing potential field. It's all about potential and what we bring to that. Now, that may not be clear what I mean by that yet, but bear with me. So, I'm going to take you through a model which is a different perspective on human intelligence. And there are three elements to this. It's a quick look at the brain, then we're going to go into the body, and then we're going to talk about what's going on outside of the body. Okay, with me so far? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cool. So, before I go into that explanation, let me just give you my definition of inspiration, because this is what I was asked to talk about. But the reality is you could almost give me any subject, and I'll have to then dig down into what's happening in our brains and our bodies. From a scientific point of view, inspiration, I would suggest, is this. Two elements. The first thing is the ability to create internal images that we can all see and all share. Now, I'm talking about leadership here. So earlier on we had a conversation around management, and for instance, being a coach, that being top of the agenda. But that's more in the one-to-one space. That's more in the relationship space. Now, what we're talking about a lot more here is leadership in the collective space. How do you take people on a leadership journey? So the first aspect of this is, what can people see in their minds? I'll come back to this. We have to be able to see it to believe it. If we cannot see it, we cannot believe it. The second thing is we have to feel it. So actually what I'm saying, and I'll give you some of the science, is inspiration is the ability to see something that you want to then feel and be a part of. See it and step into it. And when we're inspired, what it's actually doing is it's triggering our thrive response. So we have a survive instinct and we have a thrive instinct. And of course we're dominated by the fact that we have to survive first of all. So the brain processes a lot more around survival than it does around thrive. So it's vital that when we see thrive opportunities, the opportunity to grow, we step in and take those opportunities. And this is what's happening in the brain. So let's build on this. So, at the end of the day, if you're trying to inspire a group of people, they have to be able to see it, they have to be able to feel it. We are not talking about mental transactions. This happens in a deep space in our brain and in our bodies. So, a whistle-stop tour of the brain. First of all, what I'm suggesting, if you are going to go down this path of having a fresh look at humanity, you need to invest some time in really understanding the way that our brains work. We have to be careful not to treat it as just some one-stop shop. This thing we call the mind that just works on the same basis, because it doesn't. We have 4 different systems in our brain that are located in different regions of the brain, and they work on different principles. So the first of these is the basal system, which is the land of our instincts, the oldest part of the brain. You know, the part that's always aimed to look after us, and where we talk about fight or fright responses. It's there to enable us to survive. When we're in an instinctive mode, there's a lot that comes with that. On the one hand, it is our highest performance potential. When we talk about this part of the brain, picture a crocodile. Crocodiles, reptiles, a nice representation of what goes on in this space. And the reality is, crocodiles are either disinterested or they explode. And that's the way that this part of the brain works. So when it gets involved, it takes the rest of the brain with it. Okay? Equally, when we sense threat, this part of the brain takes over and causes us to withdraw. Now there's an interesting irony, or maybe even a contradiction around even when we collect data on people and they tell us they feel happy, it's not backed up by the neuroscience. Because when you neuroscientifically examine people's states for happiness, that demonstrates that we spend 73% of our time in a negative motivational state. Because we can see hormonally and neurologically the survival response being activated within us. Now that sounds like a negative message, but it isn't. I think what we've done, we've learned to cope and set our expectations at a very low level. It's like we almost can't believe the fact that we can actually be happy in work situations. So if we set it at a low level, then we're grateful for anything we can get. When I start to talk to you about the capability of the brain, I hope you will recognize that the brain is capable of doing so much more. We have brains that are capable of perfection, but we've built societies and organizations that are hugely imperfect, and they're not getting the best out of it. The next part of the brain is the emotional system, which sits in the limbic. It's the limbic system, we call it, sits in the middle of the brain. Emotions were designed with a very clear evolutionary purpose, which was to enable us to cooperate. Reptiles don't cooperate. They are very selfish creatures, just focused on their survival of themselves and their genes. So to evolve, to cope with the planet, we had to learn to operate in groups. And that's why we developed emotions. Something through which we can bond. That motivation to work together. That connectedness that's vital to who we are. So, that limbic system happens to be a hell of a lot more powerful in our brain than any thinking system that we have. We like to think that we're sometimes mentally driven creatures. We are not. Our emotions are far more powerful. It takes 250 seconds to register a thought in the brain. 250 milliseconds. It takes 80 milliseconds to register an emotion. So emotions are much, much quicker. And all our thoughts can do is try to keep up with our emotions and try to moderate them. An analogy is something like a jockey on a horse. The horse is the mixture of our emotions and instincts. The jockey does its best to influence the horse. But if the horse doesn't want to jump, it won't jump. So, this interplay between mental processing and what's happening to us emotionally is very, very significant for us to understand. If we were rational creatures, why would we ever be upset? We would just say, I don't like this feeling, so I'm going to switch it off. But it just doesn't happen like that. But nevertheless, the rational brain came along, the cortex, and through one simple discovery, it enabled us to dominate the planet. One very, very simple discovery. Which was what? Fire? No. No, empathy is part of the emotional brain. You have to do this before you have language. Ideas, that's a mixture right across the brain.
Memory.
Memory consisted right from the instinctive level. You need all parts of the brain to communicate. So this is my point, right? What we're demonstrating here is this simple discovery which has transformed our role on the earth. What we had to do to enable us to think was slow down. Slow down our responses. The point is, because emotions and instincts operate at such a speed, we always respond in the moment. When you have an emotional response, it's not delayed, right? It happens there and then, whatever the trigger was. But through evolution, we learned if we slow down our response, we allow more data. And when we allow more data, we can start introducing choices into how we respond. Just those few seconds which sort of says, hold on a minute, actually if I do this, I can go that way. If I think about this, I can go that way. Opens up the whole world of choice. And because we opened up that world of choice and developing a part of the brain which operated more slowly, we gain control of the planet. But this has huge consequences today in the sense that when we are worked up, when we are trying to change, when we're upset, there's always one thing that we have to do. Slow down. Let's keep going with this. You with me?
Yeah.
Cool. Then the most rapidly developing, the more recently developing part of the brain in evolutionary terms is this front of the cortex, which is called the prefrontal cortex. Now this is very significant because it's the only part of the brain where we can collect all data about ourselves. See, when back here we're in purely rational mode, that's just like you following a methodology. You know how to write on a piece of paper, right? You're not conscious of yourself when you do that. You just do it. You just execute it. Right? That's not about self-awareness. But evolution has worked out along the way. It's going to pay off for us to become more self-aware. So it's given us an increased capacity to do that. And that works by the fact that we have neural circuits which connect down into both the emotional and instinctive areas. So it's the only area where we can collect this total self-view, this sense of embodiment of who we are. And that's vital for whenever we are talking to people, trying to connect with them, trying to influence them, trying to lead them, we're always talking to the prefrontal cortex. It's the window to the brain. Now that has some important implications. But let's recognize just how powerful this brain is. It's not the end of the story, but our brain totally shapes our experience. And when we talk about the relationship with what's going on around us, I'll talk about the fact that we are not independent of the universe. We are part of it. Right? But this brain brings life to us, brings experience to us. And it does that by converting sensory data into something that we can recognize as meaningful and pure. To represent the power of that, let's just remind ourselves there is no such thing as color in the universe. It doesn't exist. We create it in our minds. There is no such thing as sound in the universe. We create it in our minds. No such thing as taste. It all happens in here. Gonna build on this. So whatever's going on in here, it'd be quite useful to understand it a hell of a lot better than we do so far. Another example of this brain processing is, and what touches on this visual aspect of leadership and inspiration, is that essentially the brain, like the rest of the body, is an energy machine. It's an energy processing machine. Now what that means is, when I'm looking at you, I am not constantly processing all the data that I can see in this room. I would need a much bigger brain to be able to do that. So what I do, or what I've been doing ever since I've been born, is I've been building a picture library in the back of my brain. They're called representations. So what that means is, right from day one, I've been building a view of the world. Yeah? Now that's my view of the world. Now what that means is that when, we were talking earlier on about we're all swamped by data, well of course our brains would have exactly the same problem if we tried to keep processing the same data, new data all the time. So we rely on these representations in the back of our brain to present and filter to us that data. When I look at any one of you guys, if I've seen you before, 60% of the data that I use comes from memory, from the back of my brain. And only 40% I'm actually taking in through my eyes of you. I'm constantly calling that out. And that fundamental reuse is an energy system. But the reason it's so important here is that our beliefs and what we've learned through our lives literally shape what we see. This is not just interpretation, psychological interpretation. This is biologically what we can see. So as an example, a child born to Japanese parents in Japan at the age of 1 will not be able to hear the difference between an R and an L, because there is no such difference in that language. So that ears would not have picked up the ability to differentiate. If the same child and parents if the child was born in America to the same parents, after 1 year, it would be able to hear the difference between an R and an L. And when you get into this stuff in depth, it just shows just how powerful, all our filters, all the prejudices, all the unconscious biases that we have. There's no judgment around it. It's just we've had to operate that way in order to cope with all the data that's been thrown at us. But building awareness of our own angles of seeing and experiencing the world is vital if we're to allow other people in. Make sense so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So we're still back with this theme of seeing is believing. We have to be able to see it. If I've got a picture in here, and we are constantly, every second of the day we're referring to pictures in our minds. When somebody phones you and you don't know who it is, the first thing your brain does is construct a loose mental image of that person. So you may just see somebody in a suit, if it sounds formal. But you will construct an image. You have to, or otherwise there's nothing that your brain can relate to. The one thing that your brain cannot process is nothing. It always has to create something that it can relate to. So, then we have to consider one other angle, is that when we go beyond the brain, we have to remember our brains are constantly responding to the environments that are created around us. For very good reasons, they are constantly on the outlook. It's constantly there to make sure that what's going on around us, we can understand. And our ongoing development of the brain will constantly be influenced by our environment. So again, back to this point about the environments that we've created are crucial. And we must ask the question, are we getting the best out of ourselves? The key concept that is not understood well enough is energy. This is largely bypassed in typical psychological discussion. And yet we are energetic beings. We are not psychological beings. What we process at a conscious level, which is the psychological bit, is about 1% of the data that's processed in the brain. We are so much more than that. We have this window of self-awareness where we try to understand ourselves, but that's a hell of a job. Now we need to keep going deeper and deeper and understand, how do we get into that place where we can really understand who we are? What's the evidence for why we need to do this stuff? Look around. Look at the mental health issues. Look at the stress issues. Look at the forecasts around people getting cancer. 1 in 2 people, right? Because we've built toxic environments. And I don't just mean chemically toxic, I mean socially toxic in too many situations. So we're bombarding the brain with all these threats that are basically screwing us. So, think again, understand energy. Just want to move on to the body very quickly. We have to remember in our evolution, the key takeaway here is we had bodies before we had brains. So we seem to work with assumptions that we're calling all the shots up here. We're not. When we were single cells, each cell was a sensing mechanism that was always tuned into its environment and what was going on. So every cell in our body today is still a sensing mechanism, constantly tuning into its environment. Yet so often, we ignore our bodies as a source of intelligence. And that's a fundamental mistake. All of those cells combine, and there's a somatic marker system that runs through the cell network in the body. And is constantly sending intelligence to the brain about what's really going on. When we only operate in this rational, conscious space, for instance in self-analysis, there's a huge danger that we become a slave to our own mental constructs. And those mental constructs, for instance, can be convincing ourselves that we're okay. We are usually not okay. And where you can find the proof is in the body. The brain may be saying to itself, I'm all right, I can cope, there's not a problem. The body, and in particular the heart, is saying, you may think there's not a problem, mate, but I'm having to deal with all the shit that's down here. I'm the one that's flooded with cortisol, and I know life is tough down here. And when you build these mental constructs and try to convince yourself that you're somebody you're not, you're creating a barrier between the heart and the brain that will ultimately destroy you. Ultimately, there's only one real source of suicide, and that's isolation. When we feel that nobody can touch us and nobody can help us, that's when people finally give up. And there's that separation, not only from other people, but within ourselves, that causes us the greatest anxiety. So, we actually have a human system, and what we know, I'm going to have to speed up really quickly, but fundamentally, what the science now tells us is we have a distributed intelligence system. So whereas we talk about the brain, if you talk to neurologists, they would talk about up here, the cranial brain, in the heart is the cardiac brain, and in the gut is the enteric brain. And we call them a brain because they are independent neurological systems. They do their own thing. These guys do not need to be told what to do by the brain. Okay? They were there before the brain was. They have their own intelligence system. For instance, the gut is responsible for producing 90% of the chemicals which form our emotions. They're all interconnected. Now we know when we're in a stress state, these systems are desynchronized. They're fundamentally working against each other. We're wasting energy without any productive output. That's a connection with what I was saying about working in negative motivational states. Most of the time, we are working in survival mode. We're not daft enough to say, I'm not engaged, because we don't want to be fired. But the reality is, we've learned to play the game, but inside, we know there's something deeply missing. When we synchronize, and this can be measured in very precise scientific terms, when the heart and the brain and the gut come together, we are capable of so much more. And you can measure this. It's called power spectral density. And fundamentally, it's basically a factor of about 5 times more powerful when we get into an area which sports people would call the zone. That's not just about strength, it's about our ability to process and efficiency. We become, compared with normal terms, a whole new level of humanity. So the challenge in all this piece is, why are we holding ourselves back? You know, we've built on assumptions back to the work of people like Newton and then Taylorism in organizations, which were brilliant in their own right, but which had fundamental limitations. And this is the last piece that I want to cover. So, first of all, I would say, now it's about recognizing that actually your bodies work like on a sea of emotion principle. When things are not right around us, whether it's an obvious threat or a perceived threat, it starts to create ripples in this sea of energy. And those ripples send signals to the brain saying, there's something going wrong down here, come in and check it out. Okay? But recognize that that whole process starts in the body, not in the brain. The brain cannot operate without that neurofeedback. Yeah? And once the body is said to the brain, there's a problem, nothing will change up here that says, I'm still going to go with the idea. We like to think we make decisions in an objective, data-driven space. We don't. Our decisions are driven by the emotions that we attach to the data and the impact on our instincts. And all of that is felt in the body. So, I'm getting pushed for time, so. Neuroscience and the environment. I said we constantly respond to what's going on around us. So what the hell are we going to do then about creating environments that really get the best out of us? And it's lovely to be in a position like this today, where you can see an environment that naturally calls us to perform, naturally calls us to engage. So many environments don't. Somebody said to me earlier on, the problem is after this session, I've got to go back to my normal office. You know, those things really, really matter. And I don't just mean the physical space, I mean the emotional space that we share with others. Just 2 quantum physics insights to build on the back of this. First of all, we're all connected. Physics tells us you cannot understand the behavior of a particle without understanding the total energetic system that it's a part of. That sounds esoteric. It's very relevant because that exactly applies to human beings. We are all defined by the relationships that we have, and we've tried to make sense of our lives through the way that other people respond to us. If there were no other people, we'd have no self-definition. We wouldn't exist. And secondly, we are designed to flow. We are energetic beings. Physics backs that up totally. That's all we consist of ultimately is energy. We're an energetic footprint, unique in our own right, but it's all about energy. And the key thing about energy is you cannot create it, you cannot destroy it, and it's designed to flow. It's designed to flow. What do? In organizations, we put people in boxes. We put them in hierarchies. And we do everything to disable them from flowing. We know when we're in for a flow, and you will know when we flow because you feel it. You feel synchronized. You're just there. You're just a part of what's going on. Your heart, your brain, and your gut are synchronized, and you're part of the challenges being presented to you. So, last slide. Chris will be glad to know. So, these are my takeaways, if you like, very quickly. First of all, to me, creating an inspirational culture is first and foremost about creating a collective environment which supports and calls us to grow, triggered in that thrive instinct. We've been in survival mode for far too long, which is why many of us are crumbling. When we trigger the thrive, a whole hormonal basis totally changes in the body. We're flooded with what's called oxytocin, and we want to engage. That's what we're designed to do. And where we can collectively see what success looks like. In a perfect world as a leader, I would have some sort of file and I'd go around and put it in all the heads and say, look, this is what this is about. You know, when Gareth touched on the Alex Fergusons, etc. and all that stuff, you know, we have to be able to see the same thing. We have to be able to feel it, touch it. And we have to feel that by being a part of it, we can grow. That's what inspiration truly is. What you can create up here and what you can feel down here. Thank you very much.